The evening air carried a restless energy as the pregnant wife stepped into the bustling public square, hoping only for a brief walk to clear her thoughts. She had grown used to living quietly, avoiding the places where memories of her past could haunt her, but fate had its way of throwing daggers when least expected. There, across the crowded space, she saw him, her ex-husband. His eyes locked onto her, and in an instant, the cruel smirk she knew too well crept onto his face. The weight of the past pressed down on her shoulders, threatening to suffocate her as he strode toward her with the arrogance of a man who thought he still held power over her. His words were sharp, laced with mockery, meant to slice through whatever strength she had built since leaving him. He made subtle jabs about her pregnancy, hinting that she was weak, alone, and unworthy without him. Each insult echoed in her chest, stirring old wounds that had barely begun to heal. People passed by, some catching fragments of the tension, but no one stopped. It was as if the world had chosen to ignore her quiet suffering, just as it always had when she was bound to him. Her hand instinctively cradled her swollen belly, a silent shield for the life growing within her. Fear mixed with determination in her eyes. She could not let him break her again, not now, not when so much depended on her strength. But the way his body blocked her path, the way his voice lowered into threats disguised as whispers, made her heart race faster. Desperation surged. She needed a way out, any way out, before the situation spiraled into something unbearable. And then, in the blur of fear and resolve, she scanned the crowd, searching desperately for an escape. Her chest tightened as her ex's voice grew sharper, the cruel edge in his tone pulling her back into a world of suffocation she thought she had escaped forever. The crowd moved around them, indifferent to the storm unraveling before her. Her breath quickened, her eyes darting for a lifeline, some chance to slip away unnoticed. And then, in a moment that felt both reckless and necessary, her instincts made the choice for her. She turned, stepped forward, and without hesitation, wrapped her arms around a stranger standing just a few feet away. The embrace was sudden, almost shocking even to her, but it was her only shield. Her trembling hands clutched the fabric of his coat, her swollen belly pressing against him as if to beg for safety. Tears threatened to spill, though she fought them back, her voice caught in her throat. Fear burned in her chest, yet under it lingered something else. Hope. Hope that this impulsive act would save her, that her ex would be thrown off guard, that maybe for once, fate would be kind. The stranger stiffened for only a second before his presence shifted, becoming unexpectedly steady. His arms didn't push her away but instead hovered protectively, as though shielding her was the most natural response. The warmth of his body contrasted against her cold panic, his calmness radiating into her like an anchor in a raging storm. His breathing was even, unshaken, as if he had been waiting for this very moment to step in. Around them, time seemed to slow. Her ex stood stunned, confusion flashing in his eyes at the sight of her clinging so desperately to another man. The stranger's silence was commanding, his stillness exuding a quiet power that unsettled anyone who dared challenge it. For the first time in what felt like years, she sensed a barrier between herself and her tormentor, a barrier of safety she hadn't known she could find in a stranger's arms. And in that desperate hug, tangled in fear and fragile hope, she felt the faintest glimmer of freedom. Her heart was still racing when she finally dared to lift her eyes from the stranger's chest. She expected indifference or even irritation for her impulsive act, but what she found instead startled her. His gaze was calm, steady, and impossibly warm, like someone who carried authority yet knew how to wield it with care. Whispers began to ripple through the onlookers, names murmured in hushed tones. Recognition spread across faces, and in that instant she realized this was no ordinary man. The stranger she had clung to in desperation was a billionaire, a figure of immense power, wealth, and influence, known for commanding entire boardrooms with a single word. Yet, there was no arrogance in the way he looked at her. His eyes softened, taking in her trembling hands and the protective curve of her body around her unborn child. He didn't question her actions, didn't recoil from the weight of her fear. Instead, he adjusted slightly, angling his body between her and her ex, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to shield her. His presence alone became a silent wall of protection, a reassurance she hadn't felt in so long. Her ex, who only moments ago had been so eager to belittle and control her, faltered. His sneer wavered, unease creeping into his expression as he recognized the man now standing in her corner. He tried to mask it with bravado, throwing sharp glares, but the confidence that once overpowered her was no longer so secure. Against the billionaire's quiet strength, his cruelty seemed petty, even pathetic. The billionaire didn't raise his voice, nor did he flaunt his status. Instead, he exuded an unshakable calm, his mere presence demanding respect. He placed no pressure on her, no demand for explanation, only subtle protection that spoke louder than any words. And in that moment, as her ex finally took a reluctant step back, retreating with resentment simmering in his eyes, she felt the fragile beginnings of safety. For the first time, she wasn't standing alone against the man who had broken her. She had found, by chance, someone strong enough to stand in front of her, and kind enough to do so without question. She once believed marriage would be her safe haven, a place where she could build a family with love and trust. In the early days, her ex-husband had promised her the world. He whispered sweet words about forever, about cherishing her, about walking side by side through every storm. But those promises quickly soured, replaced with coldness, betrayal, and wounds that no one else could see. What began as small cracks, missed dinners, dismissive words, secretive late nights, soon grew into gaping fractures she could no longer ignore. The betrayal cut the deepest. She discovered his infidelity not through a confession but through the carelessness of his actions, the lingering perfume on his shirts, the hidden messages on his phone, the sudden distance in his gaze. Every denial only deepened the hurt, because even as he lied, she could feel the truth pressing down on her chest. Instead of love, he gave her neglect. Instead of comfort, he gave her humiliation. And when she needed him most, when her body began to change with the weight of new life, he turned his back, treating her pregnancy as an inconvenience rather than a miracle. Her nights became endless vigils of loneliness. She would lie awake listening to the silence of their home, one hand resting on her belly, whispering to the unborn child that she would love them enough for two. The bruises weren't always on her skin. Many were carved into her heart, etched into the way he belittled her dreams and chipped away at her confidence. She learned to stop expecting kindness from him, but she never stopped holding on to her dignity, no matter how fragile it seemed. When he finally left, it wasn't with regret or hesitation. It was with the cruelty of a man who believed she could be discarded like something worn out. Pregnant and alone, she had to face the world without him, stripped of security, battling whispers from outsiders who saw her as abandoned and pitiful. Yet, beneath the grief, a quiet determination began to grow. She worked hard to provide for herself, refusing to let despair define her. She held her head high even when her heart was breaking, choosing to fight for her child's future rather than drown in what she had lost. The marriage may have broken her in pieces, but the pain also forged something new within her. From the ashes of betrayal, she began the slow, agonizing journey of rebuilding. Not as his wife, but as a woman reclaiming her strength, her dignity, and her right to be loved with the respect she deserved. The moment she realized who the stranger was, a billionaire known not just for his wealth but also for his commanding presence, her heart skipped a beat. She had never imagined that the man she clung to in desperation would turn out to be someone whose name carried power across the city. Yet in that instant, as he steadied her trembling form and met her eyes with calm reassurance, he was not a tycoon, not a symbol of wealth or influence. He was simply a man offering her safety, something she had craved for far too long. Sensing her distress, he didn't overwhelm her with questions. Instead, his words were measured, gentle. "You don't have to explain anything. But if you need a way out, I can help." It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a command. It was an offer, and that difference alone made her chest tighten with unspoken relief. Still, years of betrayal had left scars, and she hesitated, pulling back slightly, afraid to trust anyone again. The memory of her ex's lies echoed in her mind. What if this kindness was just another mask waiting to be torn away? The billionaire seemed to sense her hesitation. Rather than pushing further, he gave her space, showing her he respected her boundaries. He offered simple choices, a ride to get away from the public confrontation, a safe place to rest, or even just his presence as a shield against her ex's looming threats. Each option was free of pressure, leaving her in control, a control she had long been denied in her marriage. Her instinct screamed to retreat, to guard herself against disappointment. Yet, another part of her, the part that had fought so hard to protect her unborn child and her dignity, recognized the comfort radiating from him. It wasn't the hollow charm of a man who wanted to possess her. It was the steady strength of someone who understood what it meant to protect. Though she tried to hide it, a small flicker of hope lit within her. Maybe, just maybe, not every man would treat her as something disposable. She didn't voice her acceptance immediately, but her silence carried a shift. She didn't walk away. She didn't let go of that spark. And in her stillness, in her quiet gaze, the billionaire saw the beginning of trust taking root. The ex could not believe what he had just witnessed. The woman he thought he still controlled, the woman he believed would always cower under his shadow, had slipped through his fingers, and worse, she had done so by clinging to another man. His ego burned, his pride shattered as the memory of her desperate hug replayed in his mind. She had turned away from him, and in that moment, he felt as if the world had mocked him. That sting of humiliation grew into something darker, obsession. To him, it wasn't about love, it never had been. It was about power, about ownership. He saw her not as a person with her own choices but as a possession he had lost, and the thought of her finding safety in another man's arms gnawed at him like a disease. The fact that the stranger she turned to was none other than a billionaire only deepened his fury. In his mind, it wasn't just betrayal, it was an insult, a reminder of his own failures, his inadequacy, his inability to provide what she deserved. He began to scheme, muttering promises of revenge in the silence of his empty apartment. Each plan he considered was more destructive than the last. He wanted her to suffer for embarrassing him, for daring to defy his grip. His jealousy festered, transforming into a consuming obsession that clouded his reason. Meanwhile, the billionaire carried himself with a calm strength that only widened the contrast. Where the ex's eyes darted with rage and paranoia, the billionaire's gaze was steady, observant, protective without being overbearing. Where the ex's voice rose in threats and anger, the billionaire's words were deliberate and respectful, designed to offer reassurance rather than control. The difference was glaring. One man fed off dominance and fear, the other carried a quiet authority that inspired trust. The pregnant wife felt the shift more than anyone. She could see her ex spiraling into a toxic obsession, his bitterness chaining him to the past. But when she glanced at the billionaire, she felt a rare peace, as if standing in the presence of someone who would not let storms shake him. The contrast was undeniable. The ex was a prison she had escaped, and the billionaire, though still a stranger, seemed like a fortress she could trust. The ex's obsession, however, was far from over. His vow to reclaim what he thought was his would soon set the stage for a dangerous clash, one fueled by envy, pride, and the kind of love that had never been love at all. The billionaire did not rush her, nor did he overwhelm her with grand gestures. Instead, he offered what she had been starved of for so long: patience, kindness, and genuine attention. Their moments together unfolded in small but meaningful ways, like a warm light filling the dark corners of her heart. One evening, as they sat in his quiet garden away from the noise of the world, he noticed how her hand instinctively rested on her swollen belly. The tenderness in her touch spoke volumes. This was not just about survival, it was about love. She whispered softly to the unborn child, words meant only for tiny ears, but he caught fragments of them, hopes, promises, and dreams. His chest tightened with respect. Here was a woman who had carried the weight of betrayal and loneliness, yet her spirit still glowed with a fierce, protective love for the life growing inside her. He found himself captivated by her resilience. She did not crumble under the cruelty of her past. She had built a fragile but unshakable strength. He admired the way she smiled through her pain, even when her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of sleepless nights. When he offered her tea, or adjusted a cushion behind her back, she looked startled, not because of the act itself, but because she was unaccustomed to being cared for. That realization stirred something deep within him. For her, being in his presence was disarming. She had expected arrogance, a reminder of the men who had hurt her. Instead, She saw warmth in his gestures and sincerity in his words. He asked about her needs, not as a formality but with genuine curiosity. He didn't speak over her or dismiss her fears, he listened. And in his silence, she felt safe enough to let her guard slip, if only for moments. Their bond grew not through passion or promises but through simple acts of humanity. When she laughed softly at one of his light-hearted remarks, it surprised even her. The sound felt foreign after months of sorrow. He didn't try to claim her or fill the role of a savior, he simply stood beside her, quietly showing that respect and care could exist without condition. For the first time in a long time, she began to believe that love was not always cruel, that perhaps, just perhaps, it could also be kind. The ex could not accept the humiliation of losing his grip on her. His pride festered like an open wound, driving him to a final desperate act. He chose a crowded setting, a place where whispers traveled quickly and humiliation could cut deepest. She was out with the billionaire, walking with quiet confidence she had not felt in years, when the ex appeared, his voice sharp and venomous. He hurled accusations, twisting lies to paint her as ungrateful, weak, and dependent. He sneered at her swollen belly, cruelly suggesting she would never be wanted, that no man would ever choose her burden. The crowd grew uneasy, whispers spreading like wildfire. She froze, fear surging through her veins. Once, such words would have broken her. Once, she would have lowered her gaze and accepted the humiliation in silence. But now, before she could crumble, the billionaire stepped forward. His presence was steady, his voice calm yet commanding. He placed himself firmly between her and her ex, his protective stance speaking louder than words. "Enough," the billionaire said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The ex tried to laugh it off, calling him a fool blinded by pity. But his arrogance faltered as the billionaire's unwavering gaze bore into him, exposing every trace of cowardice. He didn't shout, didn't match the ex's venom. Instead, he spoke truths that cut deeper than any insult. He reminded the ex, and everyone listening, that true strength was not found in domination or cruelty, but in respect, love, and care. The crowd shifted, their judgment now clear. Where once the ex had enjoyed control, he now stood exposed, his cruelty laid bare in public. The mistress who once flaunted at his side was nowhere to be seen. His words, meant to shame her, had only revealed his bitterness. The pregnant wife, clutching her belly, lifted her chin with quiet dignity. The billionaire's steady hand at her side gave her the courage to meet her ex's glare without flinching. For the first time, she felt truly defended, not as a possession, but as a woman worthy of respect. As the murmurs of the crowd condemned him, the ex's downfall began. His threats rang hollow, his cruelty stripped of power. He left in disgrace, a shadow of the man who once held her captive in fear. And in that moment, everyone saw the truth. She was no longer his victim, and he was nothing more than a coward exposed. It struck her one evening, as she sat quietly across from him, that the man she had once hugged in pure desperation had become so much more than a stranger. What began as an act of survival had turned into a bond she never expected, one built not on pity or obligation but on mutual respect and genuine care. She watched the way he looked at her, not at her scars or her swollen belly, but at her soul, as though every part of her was something precious. The realization warmed her, though it frightened her too. Could she trust again after all she had endured? She lowered her gaze, afraid of the hope flickering inside her chest. But he reached across, his hand covering hers with a steadiness that eased her fears. His voice was calm yet filled with an honesty that could not be mistaken. He confessed what had been quietly growing in his heart, that her strength, her resilience, and her unbreakable spirit had captured him completely. He told her he admired her not in spite of her struggles, but because of them, and that he wanted nothing more than to stand beside her. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sorrow but of release. For so long, she had carried pain, betrayal, and loneliness, yet here was a man who saw her not as broken but as whole. For the first time, she let herself believe that love could be tender, protective, and real. She allowed herself to hope, not just for her future, but for her child's, and perhaps, for the possibility of happiness by his side. The ex who once cast such a dark shadow over her life slowly dissolved into irrelevance. His bitterness consumed him, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own cruelty. Where once his presence had dictated her every move, now he was nothing more than a cautionary memory, a reminder of what she had survived. People stopped listening to his words, stopped caring for his excuses, and he slipped into the background, forgotten by all but himself. For her, a different story unfolded. She no longer lived in fear or humiliation but in peace. The billionaire who had stepped into her life so unexpectedly gave her more than protection. He gave her the freedom to breathe, to smile without guilt, and to embrace the joy she had been denied for so long. His love was steady, not overwhelming. It grew in the quiet ways he stood by her side, in the way he cherished not just her but the child she carried. Safety was no longer a dream, it was her reality. Together, they began to build a future defined not by betrayal but by trust. She found strength in knowing that love could be gentle, healing, and real. The despair that once haunted her transformed into a quiet hope, a belief that even the darkest chapters could lead to new beginnings. Her journey proved a powerful truth. Love can appear in the most desperate of moments, sometimes when least expected. And when it is true, rooted in respect and care, it does more than comfort. It heals, it restores, and it lights the way toward a life worth living.